Fight Night is a first-person dungeon brawler with a simple premise. You play as a gladiator cursed with an inability to wield weapons, who's come in search of a mysterious tower that promises whoever commands it otherworldly power. Also, there's a French guy. The only beat-em-up I've played to completion before is Scott Pilgrim vs. a video game, and I have even less experience with grid-based dungeon crawlers, so take this review as a newcomer to the genre's perspective. And right away, I'll say that Fight Night works well as an accessible entry point into dungeon crawlers, though not to the degree where it ends up feeling like a tutorial for other games. Fight Night is far more forgiving than your average blobber, with significantly less resource management. That said, it doesn't ease you into the experience. Fight Night is frenetic, and wastes little time getting you into the first dungeon. Even movement was disorienting before I acclimated to it, and I don't just say that because I'm unfamiliar with grid-based navigation. That's probably due to the generous, but optional, head bobbing and camera shake the game has. I found the default settings apropos, but it's really nice that the developers included so many accessibility options. After that initial bout of whiplash and getting accustomed to the game's idiosyncrasies, I found that Fight Night is, for better or worse, surprisingly tame. This isn't a game that's constantly upping the ante with increasingly over-the-top antics. That isn't to say it can't be genuinely hype though, just that the experience is far more subdued than what you might expect from something with a title like Fight Night. Depending on your preferences, that's either good or bad. I appreciated it, but if you're hoping for pure hot-blooded thrills or loads of absurd humor, you might be disappointed. Surprisingly, the game didn't incessantly call attention to how your character reacts to everything, including conversations, with punching. Yeah, that might seem like faint praise, but it's such an obvious joke that I'm glad the developers decided not to overdo it. They use it sparingly enough that it remains effective. Visually, the game is anything but subtle. I can't explain why, but for some reason I'm reminded of the classic arcade game Golden Axe. Even if that specifically wasn't an inspiration, I get the impression that the developers were drawing more from colorful and stylistically exaggerated brawlers than dungeon crawlers. It's as if they took a medieval beat-em-up and ported it to a 3D environment. You might have noticed by now that objects in the game are usually monochromatic with very few exceptions. Levels will typically consist of 2 or 3 dominant colors, with a few additional ones used for key items. Oddly enough, it's something I took for granted almost immediately. I guess it's testament to the quality of the art direction that the game can use so few colors without levels ending up looking like a Dungeons & Dragons backroom. I frequently found myself lost, with some levels far worse in this regard than others, but it was never due to the uniformity of color. Items, characters, and monsters are all sprite-based, with movement implied through bouncing, stretching, and squashing the image, or switching to a different one with no animation in between. I don't know, there's probably an actual term for that last one. But this all, along with everything being composed of one color, creates the effect that you're interacting with paper cutouts, while more importantly, unambiguously communicating when an enemy is about to attack. Layered on top of all these visuals is a dithering filter that I guess creates something of a retro pixelated look. You can adjust how strongly this is applied, from barely noticeable to Legoland. On higher settings, this can definitely cut into the visual clarity, but, well, if you really want to make it look like you're playing an old DOS game, you have the option. Compared to the visuals, I found the music to be something of a mixed bag. Don't get me wrong, there's some really great tracks here. Although some not so good ones too, but more importantly, there just isn't enough variety. Each dungeon has 2 or 3 tracks outside of combat, which helps make exploring feel a little less repetitive, but each only has one generic battle theme. You're going to be getting into a lot of fights, and the longer ones can last a while. Be prepared to come out of this with at least one song stuck in your head. I just hope it isn't the Egyptian one. I think if the songs themselves were more dynamic, it'd be forgivable, but I just found so many of them monotonous. I don't have any complaints with the rest of the sound design though. The mixing is clear and distinct, which is nice because enemies have specific audio cues for when they attack, this being especially relevant for ranged attacks which can happen off screen. Oh, a cool little detail I noticed is that depending on the armor you're wearing, your footsteps make different sounds. That's pretty neat. As previously mentioned, movement in Fight Night is grid-based. You can't move diagonally while exploring, but you have the ability to strafe left and right. Other than saving you a few seconds though, there isn't much benefit to this. Well, there is one puzzle where it helped, but I'm really not sure if that was intentional or not. I hate to give away the solution, but if this is the correct way of solving it, it wasn't signposted at all. I only discovered you could do this during a moment of frustration after trying everything else I could think of. Also, it only seems to work some of the time. I'm conflicted, it's probably a bug and I just missed something, but it's so thematically fitting. Rather than combat taking place within the environment, the game transitions to an infinitely long 2-lane hallway whenever you get into an encounter. Both exploration and fights occur in real time, though you wouldn't really notice with the former aside from a couple instances. In and out of combat, controls are simple enough that you can easily play the game one-handed. You have... wait, one-handed? Huh. Anyway, you have the ability to punch, both for combat and interacting with the environment, block, use potions, and perform special moves during fights. Hold punch to charge an attack, move and attack for different strikes, and time your blocks to parry. That might sound limited, but it's really not. Fights are dynamic, with a focus on timing, and there's layers of nuance built in. For one, different armor sets come with drastically different properties and abilities. There's a total of 6 sets, and all of them, with maybe the exception of your starting armor, feel unique. On top of that, you have your specials, which come with little mini-games to perform. Though unfortunately, I found that only a few of these were particularly useful for most of the game. Each set of armor affects how many specials you can learn at a time, as well as how much special meter you have, which recharges with normal attacks. But what really adds variety to the fights is the enemies themselves. Learning their behaviors and special abilities is the main challenge the game presents. Not only that, different enemies will often synergize in interesting ways. Just for example, these mummies will move in front of the cowboy whenever he's ready to shoot, meaning you can't safely attack. An enemy formation often ends up being more than the sum total of its components. However, this also presents my biggest complaint about the combat. Once you've fought a formation a few times and figured out an effective strategy, subsequent fights lack any challenge. They become pure tedium. Take these guys as an extreme example. They're incredibly predictable, and thus easy to beat. Just back away until they've attacked 4 times, then hit them and retreat. There's no thought process or strategy needed, and my reflexes aren't being tested. So, what's the point? This tactic works regardless of what formation they're in. Exacerbating the issue is the sheer number of random encounters you'll face. Those big red guys, I've beaten them over 50 times by the end of the game, and they're essentially confined to only half of a dungeon, and it's not like I was intentionally farming them. There's a potion you can use to avoid random encounters, but its effects are limited, and you can only carry so many potions at a time. It's useful, but it won't completely save you from having to fight the same battle over and over. Fortunately, and maybe unsurprisingly, this isn't an issue with the boss fights. These represent Fight Night's combat at its absolute best. Though I wouldn't call this a particularly challenging game, the boss fights were nevertheless incredibly thrilling, requiring both strategy and skill to beat. New Game Plus also rectifies the problem with more varied encounters, but it's a little too late at that point. Okay, that section probably came off more negative than intended. I don't want to understate this. When the combat is good, it's amazing. It's an innovative and exhilarating system that just got stretched thin by too many samey encounters. When you're not in combat, you'll mostly find yourself navigating the maze-like dungeons, collecting items, and doing some light puzzling. Each of the dungeons brings with it a unique setting and gimmicks, mostly taking the form of the aforementioned puzzles. The most creative of the puzzles involved an entire dungeon where you had to keep switching between two elemental modes to proceed. But if you have any experience playing video games, you've probably seen most of these before. That doesn't necessarily mean the puzzles are mindless, and the more difficult ones will require forethought from the player. A peculiar aspect I noticed about the puzzles was that most of them made more sense from a top-down perspective than the first-person One Fight Night uses. I guess you have the option of using your map if you want. It's not a major issue anyways, it's just a bit odd. For the genre and the limited interactions imposed by the premise, these are good puzzles. They're fun, and some of them are legitimately challenging. Just don't go in expecting mist-level complexity and you'll be fine. Whenever you get a game over, you lose all progress since your last save, which you can only do in the town outside of the tower. This might seem like a major issue, and quite a few people have come to that conclusion, at least from what I can tell reading the Steam reviews. But in all honesty, I only found it a minor inconvenience. I died maybe 10 or so times during my playthrough, and I can say without a doubt that none of these game overs set me back more than a few minutes. The levels are designed in such a way that whenever you make any meaningful progress, there'll be a shortcut you can open that'll take you back to the dungeon's entrance, so you can quickly return to town, save, stock up on potions, and return. And seeing as how you've opened up a shortcut, you won't need to hazard the obstacles you face getting there. This is great level design that cuts down on a lot of possible backtracking, and it really showcases the care that was put into making these dungeons. But the way Fight Night handles game overs is ultimately pointless, because as I said, unless you're careless, it'll never have any consequences. All this mechanic really leads to is every once in a while, me having to stop my progress for a few minutes so I can head back to town. I guess you can say it's risk versus reward, but if all it's costing me is a minute or two of my time, why wouldn't I play it safe, and not possibly have to redo a large portion of a level? As I said before though, this is a very minor issue. In the end, my biggest problem with exploration was the random encounters. They just happen so frequently that they felt like they're impeding on everything else. But at the same time, it's not like I'd want them completely gone or segregated from the rest of the game. There's no perfect solution to this, but if I had to come up with something and not just complain in a video, I'd use an encounter meter. Every area gets one, and once it's empty from enough fights, no more encounters in the area until you leave and return. You've proven you can win fights, now you're free to explore. It wouldn't even detract from the challenge, seeing as how you can already return to town whenever you want. Potions are already free once you've unlocked them, so it's not like you had to manage them beyond a single trip. Originally, when I had only played halfway through the game, and was writing the first draft of this review, I was going to say something along the lines of, unless Fight Night is secretly a metaphor for the 100-Year War, there isn't much to dissect when it comes to its narrative, before moving on. And while I still feel like what's there is pretty minimal, by the ending, I came to appreciate the story. I mean, there were legitimate themes and motifs, and looking back I can say, yeah, those were pretty well executed. In particular, I enjoyed what little characterization the protagonist got. With the game's premise, I was expecting Dwarf Barbarian in terms of personality, but I was pleasantly surprised when he turned out to be a more affable sort of character. Even if this portrayal, like the rest of the game's story, was pretty backloaded. I won't spoil anything, but there's a minor detail in one of the few cutscenes that made me realize Fight Night isn't such a bad guy. The mystery surrounding the tower, on the other hand, it's nothing terrible or anything, but I ended up feeling pretty boilerplate. I wouldn't be shocked if someone told me it was a last-minute decision to tie up loose ends. Along with the main story, there's also a subplot about a pair of Mantis sisters who are ascending the tower, as well as a side quest where you can rescue a group of night watchmen. Both of these were a lot of fun to follow, with the conclusion to the Night Watchman story being especially satisfying. The other side characters don't get as much attention though, unfortunately, which left the town feeling underdeveloped. I mean, this empty building kind of epitomizes my point. Ultimately, I felt ambivalent towards Fight Night, and I don't just mean indifferent. There are truly brilliant moments, but you have to wade through long stretches of tedium to get to them. The combat is innovative and nuanced, yet so many fights ended up feeling like mindless filler. By the last few dungeons, I was ready for the game to be over. When the ending came though, I found a renewed appreciation for Fight Night. If you're able to get over how routine it can be, there's a satisfying experience to be found, doubly so if you're trying to get into dungeon crawlers. You can feel the passion that went into making this game, the effort behind designing every enemy type, dungeon, and set of armor to be unique. If you can't stand JRPG levels of random encounters though, especially ones where you actually have to be mentally present, Fight Night will try your patience. Fight Night is a game about punching things. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but it has something meaningful to say. Despite my misgivings, the charm and creativity on display was enough to keep me going, if barely at times.